One of the most common problems experienced by believers is the question, how do I know for sure that my salvation's real? Hi, I'm Pastor Allen. Welcome to New Salem's Midweek Bible Study. 2,000 years ago, the Apostle John wrote to a beloved church whose stability was being threatened by false teachers. The members of this church found themselves confused about a lot of things, including whether the experience of salvation they'd received through Christ was genuine. To ease their minds, John, who'd witnessed Jesus' ministry personally, wrote to this church, "These things I write that you may know that you have eternal life." Wouldn't you like to have that kind of confidence in your own relationship with God? Well, in previous sessions, we have looked at 1 John chapter 1 into the first part of chapter 2, where John establishes that through Jesus, we can be made right with God. Beginning in 1 John 2, verse 3, John presents 3 tests by which we can have assurance that our salvation is real. In a nutshell, the first test is the moral test, also known as the test of obedience. In other words, we examine ourselves and we ask, does my experience with Jesus make me want to do God's will? Later on, John's going to describe a relational test, called by some the test of love among believers. Under this test, we ask ourselves, does my experience with Jesus lead me to love my neighbor unconditionally? Finally, John also describes a doctrinal test, also known as the test of truth. Under this test, we ask ourselves, is what I believe in harmony with what the apostles taught about Jesus? In this session, we're going to focus in particularly on that first test, through which we can know that our salvation is real. And the way we know that is through our willingness to obey Christ's commands. In 1 John 2, verse 3, again, John writes, "By this we know that we have come to know him if we keep his commandments." Real salvation is not found in some emotional or esoteric experience, but in a living faith in and a commitment to the Lord Jesus Christ. The false teachers who were trying to infiltrate this church taught that true salvation didn't come from faith in Jesus, but from having some kind of mystical experience or vision that imparted some kind of secret knowledge. This is not too far removed from how some people today base their assurance of salvation on whether or not they've had some kind of emotional experience. Think about it. How often do we judge a worship service not by whether it leads us to walk more closely with Jesus, but whether it gives us some kind of emotional high? Now, don't get me wrong. It's true there are times when authentic, passionate worship of Jesus does engage our emotions, and it floods our souls with joy. However, there are also lots of other non-spiritual things that can give us a similar kind of emotional charge. I mean, what about the adrenaline rush you get from a particularly thrilling roller coaster? You see, an emotional buzz by itself doesn't make you any more godly. John also offers us a much more reliable marker. True salvation results in a deepening relationship with the resurrected Lord. A true experience of God will also compel us to seek conformity with his character. As A.W. Tozer once said, "The faith that does not transform you is not a faith that can save you." The Bible recognizes no faith that doesn't lead to obedience, nor does it recognize any obedience that doesn't spring from faith. The two are opposite sides of the same coin. If we've truly encountered God, the experience will leave its mark on us, and we'll pursue life differently. Think about some of the figures from the Gospels who demonstrated dramatic change after they encountered Jesus. For example, Matthew Levi was working in a tax collection booth when he encountered Jesus. Collecting taxes on behalf of the Romans was a lucrative career with a lot of perks. However, it was also a practice that was prone to corruption and involved oppressing one's own people in the name of a foreign occupying nation. But when Jesus said to Matthew, "Follow me," what did Matthew do? Immediately, he left it all behind, no questions asked. Or think about Zacchaeus, who, like Matthew, was a tax collector. Unlike Matthew, we don't have to speculate about Zacchaeus' character because he actually admitted that he habitually defrauded his neighbors. However, once he encountered Jesus, Zacchaeus was so deeply changed that he not only stopped cheating his clients, but he promised to make restitution to those he'd wronged. Or what about the woman in Luke's gospel in chapter 7 who washed Jesus' feet with her tears and dried them with her hair. She's described as someone who had lived a particularly immoral lifestyle. The insinuation from some of the crowd was that she'd been actually involved in prostitution, although, to be honest, that could have just been an assumption on their part as her critics. But her encounter with Jesus so changed her life that she risked public humiliation to perform an act of extravagant devotion towards him. And who could forget the up-and-coming rabbinical student we're introduced to in Acts chapter 7 by the name of Saul? This young man was so zealous for his religious heritage that he volunteered his services to help prosecute and persecute the followers of Jesus wherever he found them. In fact, Saul was on his way to Damascus to execute a warrant for the arrest of Christians when the resurrected and glorified Jesus interrupted his journey with a calling to a new mission. That encounter not only changed Saul's identity, but also his destiny. Today we know him as Paul, one of the first and probably the greatest Christian missionaries ever lived. And those are all inspiring stories. They remind us that our salvation doesn't flow from our obedience. Instead, our obedience flows from our salvation. As John points out in verse 3, if you're paying attention there, we come to know him first, and then we're moved to obey his commandments. As the aforementioned Paul would put it in one of his own letters in Galatians 3:20, I have been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life that I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself up for me. So there we see again, the experience of the encounter with Christ is first, and the obedience flows from that. As John goes on to tell us in 1 John 2, verse 4, the one who says, I've come to know him and doesn't keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth's not in him. We could say that the person who claims to know Christ but refuses to obey him is lying to himself, lying to God, and lying to everybody else. He's lying to himself because he thinks he's saved, but, chances are he's probably not. He's lying to God because he professes to know God, but judging from his actions, apparently he doesn't. In his book, Just Like Jesus, Max Lucado tells a story about a man who conned his way into the orchestra of the Emperor of China, even though he couldn't play a note. As Lucado tells the story, whenever the group practiced or performed, the man would hold his flute up against his lips, and he'd pretend to play, but he wouldn't be making any sound. He got a modest salary, a lot of comfortable living as a result of this. But then one day, the emperor requested a solo from each musician, and this got the man a little nervous. Obviously, there wasn't enough time to learn the instrument. He pretended to be sick, but the royal physician wasn't fooled. So on the day of his performance, the impostor took poison and killed himself. And according to Lucado, the explanation of the man's suicide led to a phrase that's found its way into the English language. He refused to face the music. In the story, the fake musician was lying to other people by pretending to be something he wasn't. By the way, that is the original definition of a hypocrite. And just like the fake musician, most hypocrites eventually trip up and reveal their true nature. You can only live a lie for so long. In contrast, John impresses on us that only in seeking to obey Christ can we progress towards the spiritual maturity that God intends for us. In 1 John 2, verse 5, he writes, but whoever follows his word, in him the love of God has truly been perfected. By this we know that we are in him. As we're drawn to follow Jesus, we see the evidence of our salvation being worked out in our lives. Think of it this way. When you genuinely love someone, you seek to please that person. You live to see a smile on their face. Because you want to see them happy, you try to do more of the things you know will make them smile and less of the things that make them sad. It's like the messy husband who wants to make his wife happy, so he stops dropping his clothes on the floor and instead puts them in the hamper. Because of our love for Jesus, we seek to please him. Another way to look at it is this. Because of our trust or our faith in Jesus, we seek to imitate him and implement his teachings into our lives. If you go to the dentist and the dentist says, you got to start flossing or your teeth are going to fall out, then you find yourself at a crossroads. If you don't trust your dentist, or if you don't care about what the dentist thinks, then you probably won't floss. However, if you do believe your dentist and you're concerned that he or she really is looking out for your best interest, what are you going to do? you're probably going to start flossing because you have faith in the dentist. When it comes down to it, the only way to follow Jesus is to follow Jesus. John says in verse 6, the one who says that he remains in him ought himself also to walk just as he walked. Acts 11:26 tells us that Jesus' followers were first called Christians in the city of Antioch. Now, in Greek, that term means something like a little Christ. Apparently, it was originally intended as an insult. Oh, look, there goes one of those little Christ. But really, being called a Christian could be a kind of a badge of honor. What the people of Antioch were saying is that those followers of Jesus were talking and acting like reproductions of the original. For a genuine follower of Jesus, there can be no higher compliment. If you're going to call yourself a Christian, then act like Christ. Not because you're trying to get something from Christ, but out of gratitude for what you've already received from him, and because you trust him. If you say you believe in Jesus, then act on what he taught. When he says, love your neighbor, go out, look for ways to love your neighbor. When he says, pray for your enemies, pray for those who've harmed you. Don't try to get back at them. When he says, stop worrying about material things and seek first God's kingdom, then stop trying to find your security and your significance based on how much money you got in the bank. Instead, start reordering your priorities in order to create opportunities for other people to hear about God's love. I mean, we could go on, but the point is that if we really do believe that Jesus was who he claimed to be, the Son of God who came into the world to offer up his life in atonement for people who were spiritually lost, well, then if we believe that, that belief should be reflected in how we live our lives. As Jesus' own half-brother, James, wrote, somebody may say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without the works, and I'll show you my faith by my works. You believe that God is one. You do well. The demons also believe and shudder. But are you willing to acknowledge, you foolish person, that faith without works is useless? Lee Robertson used to tell a story of a man and his son who traveled to a small town out west trying to track down an uncle they had never met. As they stood in the town square watching people pass by, suddenly the dad pointed to a man across the street and told his son, that's got to be him. The son said, well, how do you know? You've never seen him before. And the dad replied, because he walks just like my father. When other people watch our lives, do they recognize Jesus reflected in what we do and how we act? If not, then what needs to change in order for our conduct to line up with our confession? We'll talk some more about that in our next session. If you enjoyed this study, please give this video a like and share it with your friends. That's the best way we have to get this material out to people who might benefit from it. So thank you in advance for helping us do that. Until next time, keep walking in faith.